let's take a second look at the response that we got when trying to get all the crocodiles, or at least all the public crocodiles that are available here. So in Postman, we see here under the body this JSON. So what we notice here right in the beginning is this square bracket. And of course, there will be one at the end as well. So this indicates a list. In this list, we have individual objects which represent individual crocodiles. It is quite common for REST APIs to offer both endpoints where you're getting a list of objects, but just as well endpoints that allow us to get an individual object. So for example, here we see we have different crocodiles, we have Bert, we have Ed. Let's say that we want to get one of these crocodiles. Oh, for example here, Sobek, the crocodile-headed god as described by the Egyptian mythology. So it's a perfect candidate for example. How can we get only one crocodile? Well, to understand that, we need to go back to the API documentation. So what we'll see here in the API documentation, let me make this a bit bigger, is that under the public APIs, we have this API, we have already used this one, but then there's another endpoint here, which is used for getting a single public crocodile. And it has this notation here. So it's kind of like looks similar, and there's like this ID thing at the end. What's that? Okay, let's dig into it to better understand what's going on. So if we try to go over this, essentially this interactive API documentation, we're gonna make a request for us. And you will see here that actually the address itself, the endpoint has changed. So we have public /crocodiles, what we had before, /, and then comes this one. So what this one represents is actually the ID of the crocodile. This is how we identify a resource. So how can we get Sobek? Let's go back to Postman and try to understand how we can do that. Now I'm going to go back here to all the public crocodiles. I'm going to go back here to the API documentation. I'm going to copy here this link. And in Postman, I'm going to go ahead and open up a new tab and paste this endpoint here. Now, just this endpoint itself is not enough. So we also need essentially the base URL, which is test-api.k6.io with HTTPS in the beginning. I'm going to paste this here, and we want to make sure that we don't have any spaces, any tabs. So there shouldn't be anything in the beginning or at the end, right? So let's try and get this one. What we're getting back here is 404 not found. The resource could not be found on this server. And it's okay, because we haven't specified here any valid data. So if we want to get Sobek, then we need to see which ID does Sobek have. So we'll see here the ID is 7. If we want to get a crocodile with the ID 7, we need to replace it here. So only what you see here, the brace ID thing, we're going to replace this with 7. Let's try it once again. And now we're getting back to 100 OK. And we're going to see here, like right from the beginning, this is an object. We no longer have a list. We're getting an individual resource, an individual crocodile, for our example. Okay, so these are just the basics in terms of how to navigate through such an API. But now let's go ahead and make this request from K6 as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to copy this address here, go back in K6, and let's go ahead and make another HTTP request. This is going to be http.get, and we're going to specify here the address, essentially the resource that we want to get. Perfect. I can also remove this console log because this is not needed here. And probably the next step for us would be to really make sure that we have the right crocodile, right? So it does always make sense to add at least 2 checks, to check the status code and to check that the crocodile is Sobek, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So first of all, let's go ahead and import check from K6. And now we can start writing our checks. So the syntax for check is that we first gonna pass the response, and then we can write the different assertions. So I'm just gonna first write it as it is right now. Let's make sure that we are saving the response, and we're going to change this from a constant into a variable by using let. And let's take a look here. What can we check? So for example, we should check that the status is 200. And the assertion for that is going to be relatively simple. We're going to use the status property. And with the triple equal sign, we're going to check that it is 200. The same thing we should do also in terms of the response. So let's check that the crocodile is Sobek. So this time we're going to work with the response body. And for example, we can check if it includes Sobek, right? Also add this R here so that we have valid function. All right. So status code, and we're checking that the crocodile is Sobek. Let's go ahead and try to run this and see if it's working. What do we see here? I always try to understand what is happening. And we're always going to start, if something is looking suspicious, we're going to look from the beginning to see if there are any warnings or anything that is not correct. So this is the first request to the crocodiles. We're getting the response. And then we're making the second request. You can see here there's not much space between them. So you need to know what you're looking for. But this is when we're requesting the other crocodile. And this is the response. So it does look good. Apart from this, we're getting here an error. So we're going to try to understand what is the cause for this. So there's at least an indication here. It's going to tell us here type error, not a function, object, not very useful, definitely. And then it's going to tell us at which part of the file this is happening. So this is indicated by the line and the column. So we have something on line 9 that is incorrect. And we should try to understand what has happened there. So the code itself here with the check, it does look okay. I don't see anything weird, but probably let's take a look at the imports. I have forgotten to actually deconstruct check. So essentially there are multiple things inside case 6 here. So we cannot import check as it is here. Let's try to put it between the two braces here. And this is deconstructor in JavaScript. Essentially, it is a way of getting this. Okay, so now obviously we're getting the checks here. So this was also probably something we should have noticed previously. There were no checks. Okay, anyway, a good exercise for troubleshooting things and trying to understand what's going on. So now we have here our checks. It's looking good. We have created our request. Everybody is happy, right? Well, let me show you the following. Let's say, for example, that this endpoint all of a sudden no longer returns a crocodile, but returns all crocodiles. So I'm just going to simulate this possibility happening by simply removing the last part. And in this way, the URLs are identical. I'm going to save it, run it once again. You're going to see here, the check is still working. Why is it still working? Well, because this other HTTP response contains all crocodiles. And if we're just randomly searching for any name that appears in a big response, we're going to find Sobek. But this is not really what we wanted, right? So there's a better way to do this. Whenever we're working with JSON, we want to actually work with JavaScript objects. We want to get to individual properties. So let me explain what I mean by that. I'm going to revert here to getting the crocodile with the ID 7. And let's make what we're doing here a bit better. So how can we get to these individual properties? For example, here, if looking inside Postman, how can we get, for example, to the name? This is the property that we are actually interested in. We want to get a name and we want to check the name. So in order to do that, we need to parse this JSON. Now, this JSON that you see here in the response, this is just text. We cannot directly interact with it. So we need to parse the JSON and essentially transform this string into a JavaScript object that we can then use in our checks. Let me show you what I mean by that. So we have here the response, and I'm going to use console log just to demonstrate this. So on the response, we can call the method JSON. So JSON is going to appear here also on the list. So this is a method call. So super important, it's not a property, it's a method call. And by calling this, we are transforming JSON into a JavaScript object. And now that we have a JavaScript object, we can do things with it. But let's first look at this to see if it's working as it is right now, if we're not getting any errors. When writing scripts, we always try to make small steps to understand how our scripts are working. Okay, so what you will see here, this is what we gotten back from the response, and this is the result of what we are logging. And you're probably thinking, yeah, but this is the same, right? Well, it may look the same in the console, but from a programmatic perspective, it's not the same. Because we can do now something that on a string is not possible. So now we have here a JavaScript object, and on this JavaScript object, we can access properties. So for example, we can access the property name by writing .name. So let's do the same here. So we're going to see here as an info, we have now access to this property. Using console log to understand the structure of an object and to navigate through it is super important before using it in assertions. So always first write the console log, make sure that you know how to get to that specific property. And then when you see it in the console, you're going to say, okay, fine, it's working. And then you put it inside an assertion. So the way we're going to work with this now is we're going to replace here body includes with r.json. I'm going to try to parse the JSON here, .name. And we're going to use the triple equal sign to check that it equals Sobek. Let's give it another try. So now the crocodile is Sobek. So this check is passing. We also want to make sure that what we have here is working properly. So for example, I'm going to change here from 7 to 6. So this would be, let's say, the first check that we want to do. We want to make sure that we haven't written here an assertion that is always working, that never fails. And luckily, yes, you're going to see here that this assertion is failing. We have here a different crocodile, and this crocodile is not Sobek. So that would be like the first thing that we want to make sure. The second one would be to remove any ID from here at the end and run it once again, exactly the previous case that we had. What you're going to see here is the crocodile is not Sobek, and actually this value is undefined because we have an array and we're trying on that array to access a property, so that property doesn't exist. So this is why we're getting undefined.